The night was heavy with rain, a relentless downpour hammering against the cracked pavement of a forgotten city. The air reeked of gasoline, betrayal, and the ghosts of old promises. A dim, flickering street lamp cast a sickly yellow light over a lone figure standing by the curb, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His name was Victor Kane, a man the world had once worshipped, now reduced to whispers in the shadows. Victor had it all once: the wealth, the admiration, the kind of power that turned men into legends. But in the end, it was all taken from him. No, stolen. Not by fate, not by misfortune, but by the people he had trusted most. And for that, he would never forgive them. A slow exhale of smoke drifted into the night. He could still hear their voices, the laughter of those who had thrown him into the abyss. His former business partners, his closest allies, people he had built an empire with, had turned on him like a pack of rabid dogs. They had stripped him of everything: his company, his reputation, his very identity. He had been cast out, humiliated, left to rot in the dark corners of a world he once controlled. But what they didn't understand was that Victor Kane was not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. A car pulled up to the curb, sleek and black, its tinted windows reflecting the neon lights of the ruined cityscape. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. "You're late," Victor said, flicking his cigarette onto the wet ground. She smirked. "I had to be careful. Your name still turns heads, you know." Her name was Elise, sharp as a dagger, beautiful as sin. She had been one of the few who hadn't turned on him, or at least, that's what she wanted him to believe. Victor studied her, his gaze cold, unreadable. "Is it done?" She nodded, sliding a small envelope into his hand. "Every account, every asset they stole from you. I have the blueprints, the security codes, and the schedules. You can take it all back." Victor's fingers tightened around the envelope. For months, he had waited for this moment. While they drank champagne and celebrated his downfall, he had been rebuilding himself piece by piece. Elise leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "But there's a problem." Victor's jaw tensed. "What problem?" She hesitated. "They know you're alive. They know you're coming." A slow, dark smile spread across his lips. "Good," he whispered. Because he wanted them to see him coming. He wanted them to feel the fear crawling up their spines, the same way he had felt when they left him, with nothing. He wanted them to know that no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried, he would be all right. The rain had stopped by the time Victor Kane reached the abandoned warehouse. On the outskirts of the city, the air still carried the scent of wet asphalt and distant gasoline. But the storm had passed, just like the worst of his suffering. He stood in the shadows, watching as Elise paced back and forth inside, the glow of a single overhead bulb casting jagged silhouettes against the rusted metal walls. She was nervous. That was good. It meant she understood just how dangerous this was. Victor took his time before stepping inside, his footsteps slow, deliberate. The moment she saw him, she exhaled sharply. "They're moving fast," she said, shoving a folder onto the table between them. "After you disappeared, they got comfortable, but now they're locking things down, doubling security, cleaning up loose ends. You don't have as much time as you think." Victor picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were blueprints, security footage, and financial records. Everything Elise had gathered. But it wasn't the numbers or the layouts that interested him the most. It was the faces, His former friends? No. His enemies? Edward Lorne, the mastermind of his betrayal, the one who had orchestrated it all under the guise of a business expansion. His former partner, the man Victor had once trusted with his life, now sitting in the CEO's chair like he had earned it. Richard Vale, the enforcer, a brute with just enough intelligence to be dangerous. He was the one who made sure Victor was cut off from everything, the one who spread the rumors that he had lost his mind. And then there was Naomi Sinclair, the wild card, the one Victor had loved, stupidly, blindly, the woman who had stood beside him, whispered sweet lies into his ear, and then twisted the knife the moment he let his guard down. Victor's fingers tightened around the folder. "They think they've won," he said, his voice calm, steady. Elise leaned against the table, arms crossed. "They did win. You've been gone for almost a year, Victor. The world thinks you're dead." He looked up at her, eyes sharp. "Then let's remind them I'm not." Elise hesitated. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. I'm good. But even I can't protect you against all of them." Victor closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I don't need protection. I need them to be afraid." A smirk tugged at Elise's lips. "And how do you plan to do that?" Victor turned, walking toward a row of old metal lockers against the wall. He pulled one open, revealing an array of carefully stored weapons, knives, silencers, and a handgun he had held onto for years. "They took my money, my business, my reputation." He picked up the gun, checking the chamber before slipping it into his holster. "But they forgot one thing." Elise raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Victor looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm still Victor Kane." The first move was subtle, a whisper in the dark, a ghost returning from the grave. It started with Edward Lorne's accounts, money vanishing overnight, not in large sums, but just enough to make him question his security. Then came Richard Vale's operations, a shipment intercepted, a key deal collapsing under the weight of anonymous leaks to the press. Naomi Sinclair, however, was a different game altogether. She wasn't just part of the betrayal. She was its heart, and Victor wanted her to feel it the most, which was why, on a quiet evening, as she stepped out of her luxury car and into the towering penthouse she had stolen, she found a single envelope resting on her kitchen counter. No sign of a break-in. No alarms triggered. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, a picture of her and Victor, taken on the night of the betrayal, before she had played her part in his downfall. And on the back, in a handwriting she knew all too well, were 4 simple words: "I will be all right." Naomi's hands trembled as she dropped the photograph, her heart pounding against her ribs. She spun around, scanning the empty penthouse, but there was no one, nothing but the silence pressing in on her. She swallowed hard and pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. The call connected. "Richard," she whispered, trying to steady her voice. "He's alive." A heavy pause. Then, "We know." Her breath caught. "What do you mean, we know?" Richard exhaled sharply. "He's already hit Lorne. Money's bleeding out. I've got men tracking him, but he's a ghost." Naomi closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. "He was here, Richard. He was in my apartment." Richard cursed under his breath. "Listen to me, Naomi. You need to leave. Now." She shook her head. I'm not running from him." "You don't understand," Richard snapped. "This isn't the same Victor we knew. The man we screwed over? He's gone. What's left is something else entirely." Naomi's grip tightened around her phone. Then we kill him before he kills us." There was another pause. Then Richard spoke, his voice lower, more cautious. "It's already too late for that." Naomi frowned. "What are you talking about?" Richard inhaled sharply. "Lorne's dead." The words hit her like a brick to the chest. "Dead?" Naomi's blood ran cold. "How?" "A car explosion. Just happened an hour ago." Her stomach twisted. "You think it was him?" A bitter laugh crackled through the speaker. "Of course it was him." Naomi's legs felt weak. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had crushed Victor Kane. They had left him for dead. He wasn't supposed to come back, and he sure as hell wasn't supposed to win. She clenched her jaw. "We find him. We end this." But as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling creeping into her gut. Victor Kane wasn't just coming for them. He was already here. Across the city, Victor sat in the back of a quiet cafe, watching the breaking news on the television screen above the counter. Edward Lorne, CEO of Lorne Industries, killed in an apparent car explosion late this evening. Authorities are still investigating, but sources suggest foul play may have been involved. Victor took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't smile. He didn't need to, because this was just the beginning, and he would be all right. The city never really slept, but on this night, it felt unnaturally quiet. A storm was coming, not the kind that poured rain onto the streets, but the kind that made powerful men tremble before it arrived. Victor Kane sat in the shadows of an old, abandoned apartment building, his gaze fixed on the penthouse across the street. Naomi was in there, pacing. She had drawn the curtains, locked the doors, and activated every security measure money could buy. It would not be enough. Richard Vale was already making his move. Victor had expected nothing less. The man was an enforcer, built for violence. The moment Edward Lorne's body had been reduced to ash, Richard had begun rallying his men, fortifying his defenses. It was a logical move, but logic would not save him. Victor checked his watch. Any moment now. A distant explosion shook the night, its echo rolling across the city like distant thunder. It wasn't a large explosion, not enough to draw the full force of law enforcement, just enough to create chaos. Richard's men would scatter, desperate to secure what remained of his operations. And in that confusion, Victor would strike. Richard Vale was already on the move when he got the call. He answered without hesitation, his voice sharp. "Talk." "They hit one of the warehouses," the voice on the other end said. "West side. No casualties, but then it's a distraction." Richard cut in. "He wants us to chase ghosts while he comes for the real target." A heavy silence followed. Then, "Naomi." Richard cursed under his breath and spun the car around, tires screeching as he accelerated toward her penthouse. He had underestimated Victor once. He would not make that mistake again. Naomi sat in the dim glow of her living room, gripping a glass of whiskey she had barely touched. The silence was suffocating. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was personal. A movement in the corner of the room made her flinch. She spun, reaching for the gun beside her, but there was no one. Nothing. Just shadows stretching along the walls. She exhaled shakily. She was losing it. And then, a voice, smooth and familiar, cut through the silence. "You look nervous." She froze. Slowly, carefully, she turned. Victor Kane stood in the doorway, calm, composed, as if he had been there all along. Her breath hitched. "How did you—" Victor tilted his head slightly. "You already know the answer to that." Her grip tightened around the glass. "You shouldn't be here." And yet, here I am. Naomi's pulse pounded. What do you want? Victor took a slow step forward, then another. Answers. Closure. Maybe just a conversation. She scoffed. A conversation? He nodded. Before I kill you. Her stomach clenched, but she refused to let fear show. You don't have it in you. Victor chuckled. Naomi, if I didn't, do you really think I'd be standing here? She swallowed hard. It wasn't personal. Victor's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. Lying to me now won't save you. She opened her mouth to argue, but the front door suddenly burst open. Richard, gun drawn, eyes scanning the room in an instant. The moment he saw Victor, he fired. The bullet sliced through the air and missed. Victor moved faster than Richard expected, slipping into the shadows, as if he had vanished into thin air. Richard cursed, stepping forward, gun raised. Come out and end this, Victor. A low chuckle echoed from the darkness. I already have. Richard turned sharply. Too late. Victor was behind him before he could react. The cold press of a blade against his throat. Drop it! Victor ordered, voice steady. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then Naomi made her move. She lunged for her gun, spinning, aiming. Victor was faster. With a swift motion, he shoved Richard forward and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Naomi's shoulder, knocking her backward with a cry of pain. Her gun clattered to the floor. Richard roared in anger, swinging wildly, but Victor dodged effortlessly, delivering a brutal strike to his ribs. The enforcer staggered, coughing, but refused to go down. Victor didn't give him a second chance. Another shot. This one buried itself in Richard's leg, sending him to his knees with a strangled groan. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Naomi clutched her bleeding shoulder, staring at Victor with wide, unreadable eyes. You think this changes anything? She gasped. You think you've won? Victor took a slow step forward, crouching beside her. This was never about winning, he murmured. This was about reminding you what happens when you betray someone who trusted you.